Farmers say this has been a perfect storm. They were already battling higher growing costs and crop disease. And now China, which had previously purchased half of all U.S. exports.
Tariffs start to go into effect. Retaliations could impact Iowa farmers.
It's not just because corn prices are below break even for most. It's the fact input prices are so high, and relief specifically within the price of inputs.
Now, while some have enjoyed the long, hot summer season, that wasn't the case for farmers. Drought-like conditions have growers worried about this year's crops, especially corn.
In the last 12 months, U.S. corn exports dropped by nearly 30%. Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Europe all began signing new contracts, and almost all of them pointed to the same alternative supplier, Canada. And the man who helped accelerate that shift wasn't a trade economist or a commodity broker. It was Mark Carney. The question isn't just how this happened, it's whether the United States can reverse it at all. The trigger wasn't a single decision, it was a collision. Trump's tariff escalation against Canada in early 2025 forced Carney's government to respond, and instead of limiting that response to symbolic gestures, Canada used the moment to execute something much more calculated. While Washington was focused on applying pressure, Ottawa was on the phone with Tokyo, Seoul, Mexico City, and Brussels. Within months, Canadian exporters had locked in multi-year agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars across 4 separate regions. Japan signed deals approaching $450 million. Canadian exports to Mexico surged by nearly 50%, surpassing $400 million. European buyers began redirecting purchases away from American shipments toward Canadian grain that met their updated regulatory requirements. This wasn't a reaction, it was a strategy. The data confirms the scale of what happened. The USDA acknowledged a decline in US corn exports approaching 30% within a single year, a drop large enough to affect not just farm income, but transportation networks, storage infrastructure, and the broader agricultural economy that depends on steady export flows to stay balanced. On the production side, American farmers were already adjusting before the full impact hit. Corn planting is projected to fall from 98.8 million acres to around 95.3 million. Inventories climbed toward 9 billion bushels, while prices struggled to keep pace with rising costs, meaning that producing more no longer guaranteed better returns. The numbers don't describe a market under pressure, they describe a market in retreat. But Carney didn't create this vulnerability, he found it. US corn was already showing cracks before the trade war intensified. Buyers in Japan and South Korea had begun raising concerns about moisture content, pesticide residue levels, and inconsistencies in grain quality that hadn't surfaced in previous years. By mid-2025, multiple shipments faced outright rejection, not because of one issue, but a combination of phytosanitary failures, labeling inconsistencies, and residue concerns that triggered a loss of confidence across supply chains built on tight margins. At the same time, a structural problem that had been building for years became impossible to ignore. Nearly 94% of American corn is genetically modified. In Europe, that creates regulatory friction. In Japan, it requires specific labeling compliance. In India, it runs directly into a policy framework shaped by decades of agricultural protectionism and deep public sensitivity around GM crops, making large-scale imports of American corn politically radioactive regardless of price or availability. Canada, by contrast, had been quietly aligning its export standards with exactly what these buyers were demanding: stricter farm-level inspections, better port handling, cleaner documentation, regulatory alignment with EU and Asian certification requirements. Canada didn't win these contracts by being cheaper. It won them by being more reliable at exactly the moment reliability became the only thing buyers cared about. The consequences of this shift are landing at 3 levels simultaneously. For American farmers, the math is brutal. Rising fertilizer costs, volatile fuel prices, expensive freight rates, and now declining export volume are all hitting at once in states where agricultural income directly shapes electoral outcomes. When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick publicly criticized India for not importing American corn, framing it as unfair trade resistance, it revealed just how much anxiety had built up inside Washington. Because India isn't a market waiting to be captured, it produces most of its own corn, sources regional imports from Myanmar and Ukraine where logistics are cheaper, and has no political appetite for accepting GM crops at scale. Lutnick's comments didn't move India. They signaled that Washington was running out of easy explanations for what was happening. For global trade, the deeper problem is timing. Japan and South Korea have now locked multi-year contracts with Canadian suppliers. Those contracts don't unwind when the next harvest comes in. They compound, building infrastructure, familiarity, and trust that makes switching back increasingly costly over time. Confidence, once lost in commodity markets, doesn't return with a single good season. Here's what makes this moment genuinely different from past disruptions. In 1973, Richard Nixon imposed a soybean embargo that lasted only weeks, but the damage lasted decades. Japan responded by investing heavily in Brazilian agriculture, helping build a supply chain that turned Brazil into a dominant global exporter that still competes with the United States today. The lesson wasn't lost on China, which has spent years investing in Brazilian infrastructure, expanding domestic production, and researching alternative crop technologies, all aimed at reducing dependence on American supply. The same structural logic is now playing out with corn in Canada. When buyers diversify under pressure, they rarely fully return because the contracts lock in, the relationships deepen, and the original disruption fades while the new supply chain stays in place. Carney understood this. His government didn't just respond to Trump's tariffs. It used them as cover to execute a long-term repositioning that simultaneously built credibility with global buyers and reduced Canada's own exposure to American trade leverage.